Good afternoon. This is going to be one of those episodes where I think I'm going to get a lot of hell for this, but frankly it needs to be said. We're at a crossroads right now as a nation. We have two paths we can choose. The one leads us to a bright and better future. The other leads us to a path reflecting back on a past that is far from perfect and that will drag us further and further into the abyss. One of the things that bugs me the most is this idea from the right wing that if you're not with us, you're against us. That if you don't agree with what they have to say, that somehow you hate America. That basically denouncing racism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and all the other phobias is a bad thing. It's a good thing to denounce them. What we're seeing right now is something that has occurred throughout history when progressive forces are trying to make headway to make things better for all of us, including the very ones that don't want the change the most. We've seen it throughout history. And once again, we're at a crossroads. Where do we go? We saw this 40 years ago when the traumatic 70s, I should say, that came about because of the traumas of the 60s, resulted in the election of Ronald Reagan for anything, and he was elected primarily because people wanted morning in America again. They wanted a renewal of hope. They got it to a certain extent, but not everybody got it. And in some cases, they got it but without realizing what they'd given up to get it. Right now, it is my firm belief that we're falling back into the old Robert Barrett era, where the rich are the ones that have firm control of the country, and that anybody that tries to upset that apple cart is considered an anarchist, a socialist, a fascist, or whatever. That's furthest from the point. That's furthest from the truth. The truth of the matter is, what those of us who want to see better change in this country for a better America for everybody, is that we realize that our nation isn't what it should be. You look at the statistics about education and healthcare and economics and all other positive factors, we're way down the list. Some cases embarrassingly way down the list. And it's because of the myth that the private sector can do a better job than the public sector. It is a myth. And we've been living it for 40 years. The deregulation of government at the time seemed like a good idea. During the Carter administration, government was seemingly always having its shoestrings tied together and tripping it over its own feet. But instead of improving government efficiency, it was decided that we should take out government completely. Not at first, though. It seemed like a good idea. But over time, you were taught that government is the enemy. But yet, in America, we the people elect our government. We're responsible for electing this government. What I'm about to tell you isn't exactly some pronounced revelation. If you study the history, not just of this country, but of other countries, you will find out that from time to time, the poor and the middle class will see their interests come together and will try to push for social change or economic change or both or other changes. And the so-called establishment, the rich, will do whatever they can to resist it. It's happening now. It happened 40 years ago. It happened long before that. Right now in America, we are confronting some demons that we've needed to confront for a very long time. The demons of racism, ethnic hatreds, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, what have you. We're confronting the reality that what was promised in the Constitution has never truly been for everybody. Not even poor whites. And the sad part is, they're the ones who are fighting the battle for the very people who don't want change to begin with. LBJ said something to the effect that if you could convince the poorest white that he's better than the poorest black, that he'll gladly let you pick his pocket. It's a very cynical statement. I don't have the exact quote before me, but you can kind of get the drift. You can Google it yourself. The truth of the matter is, over a century before that, almost a century before that, I should say, there was a movement to keep poor blacks and poor whites from coming together in common cause. Because when you realize that those people who may have a different skin color but aren't any richer than you are, or working just as hard as you are, who are making just as little as you are, have a lot in common with you, you both start realizing that yes, indeed, you do have a lot in common. What is sad is that we've seen this before, and we're seeing it again. The rich, at the time, this happened in Wilmington, saw that poor whites and poor blacks were starting to work together in a cooperative sense. That threatened the very fabric of the establishment in that city, and in the state, and in the South. So what they did was, the rich people went to the pastors, dropped some coins in the church collection plate, and changed the message. Although the message may very well have been there from the start. We are of the mistaken belief that going to church every Sunday means we're hearing the Word of God unfiltered in perfect clarity. But history has proven that the person preaching the gospel isn't always pure of faith, and in some cases it's far from it. To say that religion doesn't get involved in politics is a blatant lie. We're seeing it right now. And it's not because of advancing Christ's agenda, it's advancing agendas that are pretty much all anti-Christian. But it's no surprise. We've been down this road before. It doesn't matter if it's the Catholics, it doesn't matter if it's the Baptists, it doesn't matter if it's the Presbyterians or Methodists. It's not entirely every single pastor. There are some who did stand up to this. But unfortunately, money talks. And when you're a church, and a lot of the tithes come in from a certain select group of people, politics enter the church, and the message changes. And what once was a message of love and Christian faith is about keeping the black people down, keeping the women down, keeping the brown people down. It's all throughout history. It's not a pretty one. History is not clear. History is not about winners and losers so much as survivors at times. The old saying goes, winners are the ones that write the history books. But sometimes the winners in one battle don't always win the next battle. History isn't a clear case. It's not such about dates and times and places and events. It's about motivations. Why people do things. How they did them. What were the results of those actions? And were they what the people wanted? Right now in America, we have people tearing down statues that, up until recently, we never thought about tearing down. We're confronting a lot of hostility. And instead of having leadership that is willing to try and soothe those hatreds and try to find common ground, we are confronted with leadership that wants to exploit that, wants to pit one people against another for their own gain. this hasn't exactly been something that's new in American history. We've seen it in the past many times in many places. History isn't clean cut. History books are written by people who have biases. Right now there is a movement to cleanse American history of some of the negativity that had been brought up by liberals. The truth is, it's trying to make it into a history where white people, the rich white people, are the good guys, and not the sort of bad guys. That not all of them are bad, and some of them had good intentions, but their actions were bad. History isn't perfect. History isn't clean. History isn't clean cut. The American Revolution, which we just celebrated yesterday, didn't exactly bring every man and woman and child freedom in America. That was primarily rich folks. Poor people, poor whites, were where they were before. There was a reason why not everybody wanted to leave Great Britain. It wasn't this mythical, gigantic uprising. There were, in many cases, areas of the country where it was divided, or in some cases, staying loyal to the king was in a majority. But winners write the history books. And the winners wrote that the brave men, which they were, fought off the British oppressors, which they were. But the truth is much more complex than that. If you look at the history after our independence, not a whole lot changed. The rich people that were rich before the revolution were still rich afterwards, except they had the power now. They could really make the laws. They could really tell you what to do instead of somebody far away in London. I keep telling myself that things will eventually get better. That the march of history is to make things better for everybody. But that's not entirely true. You look out through our history, there's always been groups of people that have been behind the eight ball. Native Americans, Hispanics, African Americans, and other minorities. And the ones that are always in the middle of all of this are poor whites. Because they've been the political football that rich whites have played against people that have wanted to make progress, true progress for America. To make it a fully equal society, to where everybody has an equitable chance of making themselves successful. You see, that's the problem with America right now, is that we don't look at our history and think, there are things we could fix about it. There are things we could do better. Now we look at it and go, well, we were great once, but we're not so much now. But if we try and shout and scream and all this and point fingers at other people, that will make things automatically better again. The problem is we're not looking at the right places when it comes to finding out why we don't feel like we're the greatest country in the world, and the truth is we're not. It all goes down to the fact that we don't spend the money we need to effectively in the very areas that other countries have done. We once had the greatest education system in the world. That hasn't been true for a very long time. We're told by the right that if we privatize education, things will be better. But in reality, it's proven to be anything but that. Yes, there are some examples of charter schools doing exactly what they say they're going to do to make education better, but more often than not, they fail to live up to that, and in some cases have failed spectacularly. And it all comes down to this. When the first charter schools were developed, they were nonprofits. They were noble ideas. And I thought they would be pretty good ideas. And in some cases they still are, like the one we have here in our county, Thomas Jefferson. But we're starting to see cracks because it went from being a nonprofit to being for-profit. And when you're for-profit, when you have investors, the bottom line is making money. And in modern-day America, that means streamlining, cutting cost. Not about making sure your product is the absolute best it could possibly be. We once did that. We no longer do that, unfortunately. There are a lot of great things about America, but we sometimes forget, though, that in order to be a great country, we have to confront those things that aren't so good. And there are people right now who want to blind themselves to the realities of what is going on in this country. That's not saying that the protesters that are getting too violent, rioting and looting and all of this, not all protesters are doing that, far from it. But the perception is there, and that perception, to some people, is reality. In some cases, those people who are getting violent believe that they have a right to do it because they've been repressed so long. And they've seen throughout history that sometimes you got to get a little violent to get what you want. In some cases, we're seeing that right now. Look at the movement to change the name of the Washington Redskins and the Cleveland Indians. And this is a significant movement. You're starting to see making Juneteenth a federal holiday, changing Columbus Day into Native American Day or Indigenous Peoples Day. You're seeing real movement to get rid of Confederate monuments, which, by the way, were not put up to celebrate the war, but to basically oppress black people. If you know the history of them, it wasn't never about that. Here's the thing about the Civil War, if I can take a little tangent. We love to romanticize the Civil War as this great struggle between people who believed in states' rights versus people who wanted to believe in a strong federal government. Not really. It's always been about slavery, but more than that. It was a rich man's fight. It was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Some of you are listening to this going, well, my ancestors fought bravely in the war. You never asked yourself, did they really want to fight in that war? The truth is, if you go back in time and talk to your ancestors who fought in the Civil War, and you ask them, are you proud of fighting for your cause? They may very well tell you, I didn't believe in the cause. I had to fight because I was required by law. If I didn't fight in the war, they would shoot me. That's true. They threatened if you didn't fight for the Confederacy that you would be shot for dereliction of duty. This isn't exactly unusual. The same thing happened in the Union. The same thing has happened throughout history. But if you look at the Civil War, you'll find that a lot of rich people didn't do fighting in the war. Once upon a time, they did, because it was seen as gallantry. And some rich people did go to war, commanding battalions and whatnot. Some of them didn't come home. Some of them did come home and realized, yeah, that wasn't such a good idea. War was no longer gallant. It was horrible. The Civil War was for the first time where modern technology caught up with military tactics. That you could kill people on a grand scale with modern technology, cannons, improved rifles, improved tactics. In every war since then, old school tactics have slaughtered thousands upon thousands, in some cases millions, because the people setting those tactics did not account adequately for modern technology. After Vietnam, I should say, we realized we needed to make sure we didn't make that mistake again, because this time around in Vietnam, those old school tactics didn't work. And we were flustered. And we wound up, I hate to say it, we did lose the Vietnam War. Maybe not officially. We didn't win it either. America is a complex nation. We started with simple ideals, but they were not adhered to by everybody for everybody to begin with. We proclaimed ourselves about freedom, yet we still held slaves. Proclaimed that people could improve their lot in life and yet kept poor people down. Throughout history, we've had situations where rich people have kept poor people down, and it's resulted in violent revolutions, some of which went socialist, some of which have went the other way. America wasn't supposed to be like that. We were supposed to balance things out. And in the post-war era from 1945 until 1979, we did that. We had a middle class. We had a growing middle class. Poor people saw their lot in life improve slowly but surely. We had plenty of problems, though. We still had racism, we still had sexism, we still had a lot of other things. The 60s and 70s were about change. Unfortunately, sometimes change means we go backwards in order to go forwards. I've once said, in America, the greatest advocate for socialism is the rich, because they're the ones fueling the fire, because of their greed, because of their selfishness, because of their short-sightedness. I don't believe in it, at least not in the one we're all familiar with in Venezuela, in Cuba, and North Korea. It's not really there in China anymore. China's a communist nation in name only. They're more ruthlessly capitalistic than we are, if you really want to know the truth about it. But the truth is, we live in a society today that interacts with people all around the world instantaneously. We see what life is like in Europe. We see what life is like in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and other developed industrialized countries. They have socialized healthcare, and it works for them. It's not perfect. It still needs reform. In some cases, people are actively protesting against it because they've been told that private health care is better, but then they don't realize that in America we do have it, and it's far from perfect. A great nation has to sometimes sit down and look at itself in the mirror and ask itself where it's going when we're not going in the direction we need to go. The numbers, the cold, hard numbers are there. Our economy is not doing that well right now because of the coronavirus. But in truth, even before that, the signs were not that good. The long-term signs were not that good. Regardless of what politicians say, talk to the economist at the time. And they'll tell you that the signs were troubling leading into this election. Politicians are adverse to blame, and we're seeing that now in these modern elections. Don't blame me, I'm not the one responsible. And truth be told, presidents aren't necessarily in that firm control of an economy. In many ways, they're almost the victims of the economy just as much. Excuse me, there's something on my tongue. Presidents can be just as much of a victim the economy is the very people are being put out of work because they don't have as much control as business people do, or stockbrokers, or investors, or whatnot. But right now we're seeing in this country major societal change. Plenty of people are resisting it. Some are pushing for it even harder than ever before. In some cases, it's like the 60s and 70s all over again. In other cases, it's probably making the 60s and 70s look like a walk in the park. Back then, the media was only 3 networks and your local newspapers. You didn't have radio stations presenting slanted opinion programs. You didn't have cable news networks presenting slanted opinion programs. You didn't have bloggers and video bloggers and YouTubers and all of this that's pushing stuff out there. The problem is, in this day and age, we're misinformed by the very people who are trying to, not to inform us like the journalists of the past. The journalists right now are trying to do the same thing. It's just their voices are being shouted over by people on both the left and the right, but primarily the right, who want to set the agenda, who want to set the tone. They're the ones who want to have their rhetoric on top. And I get to the point of the so-called liberal media. Look through your history of people who've used this term liberal media before. Joe McCarthy in the 1950s in his anti-communism campaign. Turned out Joe McCarthy had plenty of I'm sorry, I screwed up the Anchor podcast. The reality, we're having issues with I'm going to stop.